Minglerba. I welcome you to Community Partners International's Introduction to What is a Conflict of Interest in the Humanitarian Context. I would like to remind you that CPI and its donors take fraud and corruption seriously. This is why you are here. To gain insight to the many aspects of fraud and corruption. This presentation will provide insight that helps you understand what is a conflict of interest, and how you and your colleagues can assess if it exists. Please make yourself familiar with the training. First, I have some instructions before we start. At times I may ask you to stop and perform exercises or activities. Please use the pause and play buttons at any stage, and when I instruct you. Also, if this training is facilitated, you can gesture to the facilitator and we can stop and discuss your question at the next appropriate time. I would just like to remind you. CPI's counter-fraud approach has 4 strands of defense and action. They are: 1. Deterrence. To discourage potential perpetrators from committing fraud and corruption. 2. Prevention. Reducing the likelihood and impact, severity, of fraud and corruption through limiting the opportunities for those who cannot be deterred. 3. Detection. The identification of suspicious activity that could be fraud and corruption. 4. Response. Acting on suspicion of fraud and corruption in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes the opportunity to improve resilience. This includes investigation, applying sanctions and obtaining redress. Here is a question you should be asking yourself. It is a great way to start training like this. Why are you here? Why do I need to learn about conflict of interest? As an employee of CPI or a partner group, you may find yourself involved in situations where you have a conflict of interest with the organization. You may not even be doing anything wrong, or you never gave it much consideration. But if you have another business, a self-interest or a working relationship that could conflict with CPI's goals and business dealings, then you may have a conflict of interest, and you need to declare it, so it is clear to everyone you deal with and there is no misunderstanding. It does not mean you have to stop other businesses, but you do need to declare them. It is like playing with an open deck of cards. Everyone knows what is in play when they make decisions. This is why it is normally part of your work contracts. If you go to work for any company, it is expected that your duty is to work to achieve that company's business goals. Not another's. And not yours. Of course, we work to build our own personal career achievement and goals, which is fully supported. And what you do in your private time is your business. What about nonprofit organizations' goals and objectives? We have a particular duty working here in CPI, and partner organizations. Yes, it is a job. But it is one with wider societal goals. Unlike a for-profit organization, humanitarian organizations are established, not to profit themselves, but to better the prospects of the people they serve. So how we contribute, or use our influence at work, has an effect on these people. Okay. Let's do a 10-minute exercise to get our brain working. What do you think right now is a conflict of interest? Did you ever give it much thought? If you are by yourself, or with others, please do the following. Get a piece of paper and a pen. And write down your answers to the questions on the screen. It is okay to be wrong at this stage. This is a great way to measure your knowledge and understanding. The questions are: in your current understanding, what is a conflict of interest? And Write down 10 quick examples of a conflict of interest in a work situation. Any will do. No one will examine this, so just be as quick as possible and write what comes to mind. Let's take 10 minutes. Hit pause and I will see you when you get back. How did you go? Okay, what I want you to do is keep this information and reflect on it throughout the presentation. As a representative of CPI or your organization, we want you to understand what a conflict of interest is and what obligations you have. If you are in a group, let's just quickly give some examples of your answers. Hit pause and tell each other 2 of your examples. And then we will move on. You have 5 minutes. I will wait for you. Did you know that most of you have signed a conflict of interest form? It is part of your employee contract. Did you know most owners also require staff, and the organizations working for their funded projects, to sign and declare conflicts of interest? In fact, there can be multiple types of conflict of interest forms that an organization must manage. The main one we will be discussing today is the type employees sign. Many organizations actually ask that it is signed annually. Employees and organizations should update their situation throughout the year. If things change, like if your brother or sister joins your workplace and no one knows you are supervising them. First, let's look at some definitions. You will find slightly different definitions in varying publications and web sources, but the main points will be relevant. Normally, the definition will vary depending on what type of sector the publication is in, like finance, project management or health. Most are written for commercial companies, but the intentions are relevant. I will dissect one definition provided by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. A conflict of interest involves an employee's, or agent's, self-dealing. I will say that again. A conflict of interest involves an employee's, or agent's, self-dealing. An agent in this case would be someone acting on behalf of the organization. This is the first hint of why you are here. A conflict of interest is related directly to an employee's actions. That includes you. To continue. A conflict of interest occurs when an employee, manager, or executive has an undisclosed economic or personal interest in a transaction that adversely affects that person's employer. Again, that adversely affects that person's employer. Do you see the word interest in yellow? This is highlighting when an employee's interest is conflicting with their workplace's operations or business decisions. But because we are a humanitarian organization, I would suggest that this is also about the effect on our beneficiaries, donors and partners. Now that we have defined a conflict of interest, I must tell you that in certain circumstances, it can be considered a crime. As mentioned, a conflict of interest scheme involves the focus of an employee's influence over a work transaction or a decision that is to the disadvantage of their organization. If it is intentional, then it may be considered a fraud or corruption event. Conflict of interests can look the same, but is different from bribery schemes. Bribery is where the fraudster is paid or bribed to exercise their influence, generally on behalf of someone else. A conflict of interest is basically the work of the perpetrator, an employee or agent. Okay, now, I want to show you through some examples. These involve a conflict of interest that are frauds. This is how a sales, purchasing scheme may look. An organization, say CPI, wants to purchase a large amount of goods. Someone in the organization influences them to buy from a particular company. This can be someone in procurement, the boss or a supervisor who has influence. In fact, what he has not told the organization is that he owns the company. He commits the fraud by negotiating a high price for himself, tampers with bids to favor his company, or just approve false invoices from his company. Welcome back. Let's look at 5 more examples of conflict of interests. After each one, let's quickly pause and give an example for more clarity. Conflicts of interest come in many forms. Here are some more examples so you get the idea. Providing special treatment to someone, for example hiring, promoting or working with someone connected to the employee. Receiving gifts or kickbacks. Using company property for personal benefit, for example stealing office supplies, or using the work car for a second job. Giving confidential information to competitors or using it to start another business. Working on outside work or business activities, for example, taking sick leave to work at another job or working for a vendor of the company part-time. Are any of these a crime? Would you get arrested for doing any of these? No, not really, but the organization would not want you doing these without proper approval. If you declared your interest to the correct authority in your organization, you should be fine. But you have to be careful to avoid being blamed for the wrong thing. Let's have a look. Special treatment. It is always best to go through the proper channels of employing and promoting, and separate yourself from the process. Receiving a gift or kickback? Sometimes vendors force these on you. You really have no choice. If you did not declare them, you could be accused of taking kickbacks. You may not have done anything wrong, but it is also the perception, and people can accuse you of it. So, declare them when it happens and the organization needs to take the appropriate action. That is why organizations have gift registries. So it is on record. Using company property? Again, generally declare it with the administration department. Ask to use property and for what purpose. It is declared and on record. Giving confidential information away? What do you think? You should never give confidential information away. That would be stealing. If you used it for your own work, or to get a job, that would be a conflict of interest, And although companies may not call the police, it would be considered a very bad action. You can always ask your organization. Let them decide. Performing outside work or business activities? Again, declare it. But it is your obligation during work hours to perform for your organization. Getting the idea? These may not be reasons for arrest, but if it is intentional and a conflict of interest, then it can become a problem. I think people know this. Let's do one more question. A multiple choice. You are part of the tender committee, but you just found out that the organization where your cousin sister works, Health Action 365, has submitted a partner tender proposal to CPI. Your cousin sister has asked you to do everything possible to make sure that their organization will win the contract, because your job there depends on it. Which is the most appropriate answer? A. Tell your colleague, your brother, on the committee to select Health Action 365. B. Do not say anything. C. Report the conflict of interest to your organization. D. Hire an accountant for advice. Hit pause and declare your answer. Now I want you to look at the handout. NHS procurement. Take 5 to 10 minutes and discuss the conflict of interest issues in it. Please read it like you are the CEO of the British NHS, that is the National Health Service in Britain. The media has asked you to comment. Do you think the guy had a conflict of interest? Do you think his notification to the NHS was adequate? This really happened, and it happens a lot. What should have occurred? All right. We are nearing the end. But here is something you could use in assessing, or understanding the nature of a conflict of interest that you may be thinking about. Actual. Potential. Perceived. Conflicts of interest. Let's read and understand them. The word charity is here. But I will use organization instead. Actual. You are being influenced by a conflict of interest. This is where you are involved in a decision at work, but you have an interest in this. It can influence the decision you are making for the organization you work at. The example here is: your organization is proposing grants to 10 kindergartens, but there are 20 who applied. Your child attends one. You know you hate the school supplies and equipment there, but their application was very poor. In this case, you are probably being influenced. In any case, it is hard to be impartial. What should you do? Potential. You could be influenced by your conflict of interest. You are a part-time board member for CPI and do not work on grant proposals. But now you have started work at 365 INGO in the grant proposal section. Both CPI and 365 INGO are applying for the new LIFT project grant. It requires a lot of work and knowledge. Who are your interests with? You might be influenced by 365 INGO for CPI's details. Or the other way around. What will influence you? What should you do? Perceived. You could appear you have a conflict of interest. You are the administration manager of CPI, who is reviewing a tender for services for the CPI office. Your brother works at one of the companies. You think you can assess the tenders fairly. And maybe you can. But what happens if you chose your brother's company, because it was the best? Then another company went to the papers complaining about CPI and that your brother works at the selected company? You may have selected the best company. but you appear to have, or a perceived conflict of interest to explain. And CPI looks bad in the newspapers. What should you do? You can see from those examples that recognizing a conflict of interest is a little challenging. We have to decide if it is actually, potentially, or even a perceived issue. But the best thing is to report, or document it in your decision making. And have it approved by an appropriate person. Conflicts of interest have an ethical dimension. They are tricky. Let's wrap up the training. Here are the 6 main points. 1. A conflict of interest involves an employee's self-dealing. 2. A conflict of interest occurs when there is an undisclosed economic or personal interest in a transaction. 3. Conflicts of interest are events or existing influences that adversely affects that person's employer. 4. Balance your work priorities. Know what your decisions influence. 5. Remember, conflicts of interest can be actual, potential, or perceived. And finally, 6. Remember, a conflict of interest occurs when there is an undisclosed interest. So declare them. That way, everyone knows what is in play, especially with those important business decisions. Thank you for your attention. We hope you have learned enough about conflicts of interest to inform your decision making. Now, do you have any questions?